Welcome back. In this module, Graham and I are going to talk about non-relational data types. We'll talk about XML, we'll talk about JSON, we'll talk about using a document database, and we'll even talk a little bit about spatial data for maps. All right, well, to talk about XML in SQL Server has a little bit of prerequisite knowledge needed. And this course isn't designed to get into any real depth about XML, but help you understand where XML fits in the overall scheme of things with SQL Server. So let's start with a very quick primer on what XML is about. And so you'll see a blob of XML on my screen. And if you've never worked with XML before, it may look like, boy, there's a lot of stuff there. If you've worked with XML, you'll probably recognize quite a few things. So again, without going in tremendous depth, let's talk about what XML represents and why you might use it. So why work with XML data in SQL Server or in Azure SQL Database? Well, basically, it's because you already have XML, and you need to store it. You need to be able to transmit it between applications. You're typically not going to be creating new applications using a SQL database and then decide to use XML as the data type. Typically, you're using XML because you're already interchanging with other applications. So let's take a quick look at what makes this XML. The first thing you might notice as you're looking at the code is that everything's wrapped in angle brackets, and if you've worked with other markup languages like HTML, for example, this might look familiar. Let's take a look at some of the things that make this up. So we start with a processing instruction. That first line that begins and ends with question marks is essentially an instruction to the parser that's built into whatever application is working with the XML. So SQL Server and Azure SQL Database have a built-in XML parser, as does a web browser, for example. So that's a processing instruction that just happens to say things like, what version of XML am I? What kind of character encoding am I using? It's not stuff that we're going to care about much, except that your parser will want it there. And then you'll start to see the actual payload of the XML in the form of elements. And so the interesting thing about XML is that, unlike HTML, the elements are user-defined, or in this case, developer-defined. That's us. So we're defining an element called salesperson, for example. And here we've got a salesperson, and there's an ID value and a name value, and those are actually going to be called attributes. Again, these are things that we define, and the beauty about working with this in SQL Server is that SQL Server can recognize them, and SQL Server can store them and operate on them. So we've got elements such as the salesperson, and we're storing attributes like their ID and their name. We'll see the ability to store those attributes either as quote delimited or simply as text. And the difference between these basically goes to what kind of programmatic operations you'll perform to extract or modify those. You'll see, again, more interesting things with collections of attributes. I've got a collection here called items, and it's got two different item attributes, which then, item elements, which then have attributes. And there's no sort order about this yet. The only real rules are that the brackets have to match and that it is case sensitive. So how do I work with this with SQL Server? Let's take some sample data. I've got a portion of a table. In this case, I'm going to use a sample table called salesLT.customer. And I'm going to pull the last name out of it, but I'm going to use the top operator here simply to prevent pulling hundreds and thousands of records out of the column. So I'm going to say select top 5 last name from salesLT.customer. And if I ran that all by itself, I'd get results similar to what you see on the right-hand side of my screen. But if I add some of SQL Server's XML processing instructions, I can get that converted to XML without having to write a whole lot of additional code. So in this particular case, I'm saying I want these results as XML using an auto formatting rule, and I'm going to wrap these in a root element called customer. So if you recall from the previous slide, we had a sales order, and now we've got one called customer. So if I execute this in SQL Server, I'll get a result back similar to what you see. So it says, all right, well, for each of these customers, we're going to give it an element name of sales.lt.customer. That's the table name. And what's doing this is that auto instruction. And then the column name of last name equals, and then we've got the attribute value, which is G or Harris or Carreras or what have you. So that's one way you can work with XML. And so you can have data that's not even in XML in SQL Server and retrieve it in that form. Now, I should point out there's a bit more to it than that as you get into the nuts and bolts of it. For example, SQL Server doesn't put that prologue. And there are some other bits to the XML that a very strict parser might object to. And so you might have to do some additional massaging. Some other things you can do with XML in SQL Server and Azure SQL Database are do things like passing in an entire blob of XML in a variable, for example, and then traversing the hierarchy in that XML to pull out information. So here we've got some code using the from open XML function where we're passing in a variable and then we're telling it what part of the tree to traverse. So start at the root level and move down to the customer level. And then take those results and assign them column names of customer ID and contact name. And so the results might look like this. So the idea here is you can have an application pass in a chunk of XML as text, and SQL Server will be able to interpret it and figure out what the hierarchy is, what's an element, what's a child element, what's an attribute, what's a value, and bring those back. I'll show you more of this later in the course. So how do we do this? What's available? There's a wide range of things for XML support in SQL Server. I won't read this slide to you, but you'll see some of the options. So there's an XML data type, for example, where we can actually store the XML in a native form. Instead of storing it as text and having to convert it to and fro, we can store it in an XML value. There's the XML, the XQuery feature that gives us that language that will enable us to walk down the nodes of the hierarchy. There are a whole set of index structures that we can build to improve performance, and so on.
So the XML stuff looks pretty useful. I think a lot of people have worked with XML and need to work with that. Let's see an example of that.
All right, we've got a demo. Let's take a look.